What do Francis Ngannou and Michelangelo have in common? More than you might expect.
I don't know.
They both made it way after everyone expected them to.
So Michelangelo is very famous for his sculpture, and in his 70s, he really flourishes.
Don't just take my word for it. Francis Ngannou is a late bloomer.
Born in Cameroon, and he's doing child labour. By the time he's 26, he has to leave with smugglers to get to Europe. And he trains in a gym until he becomes an MMA champion.
In 2005, Henry Oliver was studying English at the University of Oxford. When he left, he went to advise some of the biggest companies in the world, like HSBC, Easyjet, and Volkswagen, on how to hire the best people. And he now has a book out, Second Act, featuring stories from the most influential people of all time. And his fans are among the world's smartest minds.
It is really nice to sit down at your desk in the morning and be able to just do your work and be good at it.
He talks about fascinating topics.
They're spending so much money to try and persuade everyone.
Breaks down how you can change your life.
If you look at surveys, networks are one of the highest mechanisms by which people find jobs now.
Zuckerberg and Bezos achieved greatness in their 20s. But for you, the best may be yet to come. I mean, I am so excited about chatting to you about late bloomers and everything you've done with the book. I think like a big part of why I set Jimmy's Jobs of the Future up was because I believe that the world is moving faster and faster, and sometimes it can feel like you're getting left behind earlier and earlier in life. And actually, I didn't really find my stride until kind of mid to late 20s. And actually, a lot of the time, I still don't feel like I have either. But I think it's just really interesting because, we funnel people, particularly in the United Kingdom, often down very narrow paths quite quickly, I find, with the university system. And your whole exploration and what you write in your Substack with a common reader as well, this exploration of talent and how we maximise talent and how it changes at different points in our lives, I just think is really interesting. So I've got, and so many of the names in the book were so interesting in terms of how, you look back at their lives and you think it's like been the linear journey and whatever, and actually it's not, and no one's is. So I'm really looking forward to chatting to you about all that. But first, I think you've got a really interesting sort of job title on LinkedIn, right? Which can be sometimes pretty rare. But explain to us, what is an employer brand consultant?
So you know what a brand is. If you want to sell chocolate or trainers or shoes or something, you've got to have a way of talking to the public about why these shoes are good. All large corporations have to do the same thing, but for why these jobs are good. Right? So they're recruiting, if you're FTSE 100, maybe even a FTSE 250 business, you're recruiting hundreds of graduates every year. Plus you've got all the churn on it, people with experience in their careers, right? Now, when you get up to the top sort of executive levels, it's all headhunting. Yeah. And they know they know who they want to work for, and it's all sort of done. But as you go further down, the question is like, do I really want to go to this company? Yeah. And it's really difficult to know, actually, like, would I actually fit in there? Is that a good working environment? What's the culture like? Like, there are certain things you can get from a job description. Does it pay what I need? Does it let me do what I want to do? But there's a lot of intangible stuff about I'm going to go and work for these people. And the employer brand is supposed to try and like sell you the job in the way that consumer branding sells you the shoe or the chocolate bar or whatever.
Oh, I find that really interesting because, for example, 4 of the biggest graduate recruiters are EY, PwC, KPMG, and Deloitte. Yeah. Now, I couldn't really tell you much difference between the 4 of them. I can tell you a bit of where they sort of specialise in different sectors and so on. But actually, in terms of the culture, I couldn't really tell you much about them and how they're different. And I'm sure they probably are. And once you're in the system and in the industry, it's probably quite different. But I couldn't tell
They would tell you that they're very different.
I'm sure
they'd be horrified to hear this. They're spending so much money to try and persuade everyone. But no, I mean, if you go in and like, I've worked for, I think, a couple of those big 4. If you go in and experience the culture, it starts to become really apparent. what the differences are. And it's easy for those differences to look very like, I'm not an accountant, I'm not a consultant. To me, it's just going to look like people in suits with PowerPoints and whatever.
Yeah.
But those are real differences. Like, I'll give you one example. We had a client that was a big bank, right? One of the major banks. And I thought, well, this is going to be, how can you distinguish between working at one bank and another? This must be hopeless. And we did some interviews with the recruiters, the external headhunters who worked for them. And I said, look, you guys go into all the banks, so you know what the differences are. And they said, when you're in the lobby, people move slower in this bank.
Right.
And this gave me a way into thinking about, like, it's still a bank, it's still finance, it's still intense and whatever, but it's really a very different culture. It's a much more humane, gentle sort of lifestyle. Someone said it's the lifestyle bank. I don't think that's the right word, but like, there is a huge day-to-day difference working somewhere like that. There's another bank, and what people say in the industry is they don't stab you in the back there, they stab you in the front.
Yeah.
So there are these cultural differences, but you have to get inside and sort of really find out what they are. And that's basically the job.
I think it's got so much easier to apply for a job.
Yeah.
And so we're asking about how employer branding has changed it. Like, with people working at home, all the easy to click apply on LinkedIn and so on. Just how's employer branding changed over the last 5 years, do you think?
My view is that you're seeing two things. The nature of the firm is changing, and the nature of the job market is changing. So a firm, I think, is becoming much more capable of operating with lots of freelancers, lots of contractors, lots of people who are sort of in and out, because transaction costs are coming down on that stuff.
Yeah.
And so you think about like the Uber model, where there's like a core of people who work for you full time in the office, whatever, and then there'll be a sort of periphery of people who are coming and going.
Yeah.
So that changes the sort of relationship you have with candidates. It makes it much more sense to think about, for some people, they come in, they do a few years, they leave. We have an alumni reputation with them. But for others, you want that kind of ongoing, almost customer relationship management kind of approach, right? And you need to think more carefully about managing your pool of freelancers. In the jobs market, what you see is basically a fight between Google and Microsoft, right? So Google offers you search, whatever job, baker, podcaster, whatever. Google will just show you the jobs, and they will be a lot more in control of what you see than the company. I'm not being sent straight to the job description anymore. I'm being shown Google Jobs' extract. They say, a lot of employers don't put the salary on, which is infuriating for candidates. So Google will estimate the salary. And they're trying to sort of force companies to put salaries on.
Okay.
Now, on the other side, you've got Microsoft doing LinkedIn.
But before that, on the Google, but they're estimating are they estimating the company's salary, or do they have enough data on you?
Jobs like this tend to pay salaries between X and Y.
Correct.
So sometimes the range is quite big, and it's like, that's not helping anyone.
Yeah.
But it does, people want to know the salary. It's one of the very first things they want to know. It's a waste of time applying for a job that's, outside of your bracket, right?
Yeah.
So then on the other side, you've got LinkedIn, which is Microsoft's approach is like the permanent online CV attached to a kind of social media platform. In my view, these two things are going to have to try and fit together technologically at some point.
Yeah.
And so you can see how your LinkedIn profile becomes part of the way that CRM is done for jobs, right? And you can be more easily matched with whatever jobs are available on Google. And the matching problem is the big one, right? In economic terms, getting the right people in the right jobs is a constant. It's been a political headache for the last few years. With all the dislocation after the pandemic. So that's kind of
I actually say thank you to former guest Matt Clifford for retweeting some of your work, because that's how I first came across you. I mean, that's not even necessarily job matching, but even that
it is.
Discovery process.
But that's what I'm saying, right? The network and the use of things like that as a way of discovering people you want to work with on however ongoing, temporary, part-timer basis, that has become much, much more important. So many people say I got my job just by being active on Twitter, right? Like this kind of LinkedIn model is really displacing parts of the Google model. It's no longer just, job ads. You find the ad you want, you apply. Like, it can all just happen through networks. Networks, if you look at surveys, networks are one of the highest mechanisms by which people find jobs now.
Yeah.
Much, as much as important as, say, careers websites, I think.
It's funny when people just come in here and, they work on a project for kind of 3 months and so on. And they're often young people early on in their careers. But one of the things I say is, like, want you to be active on LinkedIn. And like, if nothing else, by the end of this 3 months, you'll know how to use the platform and you'll build connections, etc. I think it's so kind of important. And it's an amazing tool that didn't exist when you and I started out, really, or it was
absolutely
in its infancy.
You can think of this as think you've worked in Westminster, right?
Yeah.
So in Westminster, the job advert, they're all the same. They're all from the same template. And when you look at it, it really tells you nothing.
Yeah.
What you need to do is find someone who works in the office of that person and say, are we dealing with a maniac, right? A violent lunatic? Someone really boring who's just going to have me licking envelopes? What's the game? You have to get that info. That is much more a part of normal job searching. So many women under the age of 35 report in surveys that if they're sort of considering a company quite seriously, they will try and find another woman they know, 2 degrees removed, whatever, to just have someone say, yes, it actually is an okay place, because all companies say we're so diverse, we're so whatever. But actually, are women getting promoted? Is the mat leave handled well? Just all these kind of practical questions.
Yes.
The more you can get a sort of response from your network, the more comfortable you are. Network hires outperform non-network hires on the whole.
Yeah.
So there's a genuine it's not sort of just nepotistic. There's a genuine function of getting good information. The network will tell you, no, we've worked with that guy. His CV looks good, but this one on the other hand, very good candidate. So it's all moving much more that way, and you can see why LinkedIn is, and what that means from a brand point of view is you have less control.
Yeah.
You can't just put your website and your flyers and your posters and whatever and Twitter and have people sort of say, well, that's what it is. There's all this other activity going on.
Yeah.
A bit like Westminster, that you can't stop it. Once they've said it, you can't stop it.
But it is this, that thing about politicians as employer brands is interesting as well, because if they're labelled rising star, probably about to have quite a big intake of Labour MPs, or actually we'll have a big intake of Conservative MPs as well, because lots are standing down, etc.
Yeah.
But that employer brand flywheel becomes quite important. They get labelled as a rising star by the Spectator or whoever, and then somebody thinks, well, actually, I've read that person's name before. That's I hadn't thought of it like that.
And to think about, you did that interview with Timpson, James Timpson, right? That, I'm not trying to say that you were just sort of doing his marketing for him, but in a way, that was a really great piece of employer branding content.
Yeah.
Rather than having some advert or some content online, he just embodies the spirit of his company, and he's so compelling to watch, and he's in the shop fixing shoes or whatever.
Yeah.
That tells you so much about where you're going to work.
Yeah.
That it's very difficult to get that across. You give it to me and I can try and write you something and we can make a little video and, actually just watch the guy at work and you go, wow.
Yeah.
I'd like to work there.
Yeah. It was genuinely very impressive.
Yeah. So that's the golden ticket.
So who's got it? Well, so breaking rule here, ask too many questions at once, but does a point where employer branding doesn't matter as much? One of the interesting observations I think over the last 20 years in this century is how sort of investment banks have kind of been dethroned as the sort of top employer brand by technology companies, and arguably perhaps again by entrepreneurship. But who else has got some good employer brands that we might not associate with? Because I guess a lot of the employer brand comes from being a consumer facing brand. So perhaps the question that I'm actually trying to ask is which B2B brands have got good?
Yeah, I don't think it all comes from consumer. If you're 23 and you haven't done much work, the consumer brand plays an outsized role in how you think about a brand. But if you're 33 and you've been at work for a decade or more,
Yeah.
You know, like you've interacted with so many other organizations, you know the industry, you know what's going on, that actually the B2B reputation, however like explicit or implicit it is really guiding you a lot more. You know people who've worked there, people have come and worked with you and said, oh my God, you never go home, it's a nightmare, they bully you, like whatever, or they come in and say, oh, this is no good. I liked it at the old place, we got on with things, this is slow. Like you get all that information. So the B2B brand is really much more important, but it makes it impossible for me to tell you, this is the core point, right? Unless you're in the industry, it's very difficult to know. A really good consumer brand that works as an employer brand, though, is somewhere like Primark. Right, so when Primark opens a new store, people are queuing through the shopping mall, waiting for opening time, right? Day one. Now that's crazy. That does not happen if they open a new John Lewis or whatever. And this kind of enthusiasm, this fan base, whatever you want to call it, obviously has great positive spillover for employer branding, and you want to recruit from that pool. The general problem, though, is that whereas on the consumer side you want to sell as many t-shirts as possible and you're not at all picky about who buys them, on the employer branding side your job really is to say, most of you are completely unsuitable to work here.
Yeah.
Please don't cost us a lot of money with long selection, recruitment, interviewing, whatever processes. So the employer brand is also trying to put you off, not necessarily in a kind of, this isn't for wimps, well, maybe if you're the army, but trying to emphasize really strongly what it is that we are good at. What, like that Timpson video,
yeah,
that a lot of people will sort of think, God, I couldn't do that.
Yeah.
I don't have the, I'm not energetic in that way, or I want something easier, I want something more straightforward. That's a really good function of the employer brand.
But it is also interesting that the differentiation you made between the 22 and the 32-year-old.
Yeah.
22-year-old knows nothing about the job market, next to nothing about it. 32-year-old actually probably knows like a huge amount. And so when they're trying to recruit the 32-year-olds with a 10 years experience and so on, they kind of know what they're going after. But doesn't that then mean that they're kind of narrowing their talent pool?
Well, so you have to distinguish between hiring from within the industry and without.
Yeah.
It depends. That will come down to the job. So if you're like a supermarket and you want to hire software developers, engineers, right, for all the back-end logistics, using AI to work out more efficient routes to do food deliveries like Ocado does, or I mean, they all do that now.
Yeah.
How much retail experience is good?
Yeah.
And how much retail experience is like, we're just going to be importing the behind the curve slowness of our industry that we're trying to break free from.
Yeah.
And we don't honestly care if you know the first thing about supermarkets. What we want is that you can like really, this is just a technical challenge and we need you to solve it.
Yeah.
Your problem then is like, they're going to look at you and think, supermarket, I could be working in, So you've really got to prove your creds. So it varies depending, right? Whereas if you're hiring like store managers,
yeah,
most of those will come from other supermarkets, but you're going to think creatively about other retails and retail experience. Like, are you a big box manager?
Yeah.
Well, you could move over and run a massive supermarket and do really well. You probably haven't thought of that. And in a lot of jobs, you'd get a kind of pro forma response like, oh, so sorry, you don't have 6 years of food retail experience, blah, blah, blah. The imaginative people will say, well, they've run X thousand square feet with X hundred employees. It's cabbages, not trainers. Yeah. But actually, we need culturally, there's something that person has that we'll benefit from. So it's job by job, right?
Yeah.
Thinking about whether you're going internal or external. But yeah, you want to avoid too much like hiring the same people from the same company where the cultural, like the big four, it's like, it can become a roundabout.
I just think, it's an interesting example. And that exterior culture is a very interesting point in terms of, people move quicker here at this bank and so on. And it is that. And sometimes people talk about culture kind of being in the walls and so on.
Well, it is, yeah.
Exactly, but it's all those kind of like subtle differences that people just, it feels like a place with energy and got something about it.
If you're ever trying to think like, do I want to take my career to this particular organization, you really want to find someone who has been there for between 3 and 9 months, because they've been there long enough that they actually know their way around by now and they can tell you what it's like.
Yeah.
But not so long that they've kind of got over the initial shock of whatever the differences were, so that they can say quite honestly, like, this is right. It's like having kids. If you've got a baby, you should only talk to someone else with a baby. If you talk to me, I'm going to be like, I don't know, it was a long time ago, it was fine, wasn't it?
Yeah.
That's probably not the right answer.
True.
So that, that cultural knowledge is really important, but to be able to see it with fresh eyes is the
that
difficult
sort of sweet spot of 3 to 9 months as well. It's really interesting. One of the things you talk about in the book is those that are late bloomers sort of often have a tendency to kind of meander through careers, and there's no sort of path, and people discover things along the way. How did you discover that you wanted to write this book?
When I worked in employer branding, I still do freelance a bit, but when I was a full-time job, I was doing research and brand positioning.
Yeah.
So clients would come to me and say, we need to demonstrate to our senior leaders that you don't have to have a 2-1 from Oxford to work at a law firm anymore.
Yeah.
We need, an evidence pack. We need a briefing note, whatever. So I was the one looking up all this stuff to try and argue, like, you can have a degree. And major law firms now hire from like 30 different universities, and they don't care what grade you got.
Yeah.
And it's fine, like, it works.
And what are they looking for?
It's most like, obviously you need to be smart enough,
Yeah.
but the correlation between your degree and your smarts is much lower than a lot of people would like it to be, right? It's all personality traits, right?
Yeah.
Determination, right? Being interested enough in corporate law to actually sit there for like 12 hours a day and, get it done on a deadline.
Yeah.
Earnestness, like all these kind of traits. But so they were asking me all these questions, and these questions of, as with that one I just discussed, is an example of like, how can we broaden our talent pool?
Yeah.
Right. So for years we've done 2-1s from Oxford and Cambridge, and we're running out of people, and then we're not diverse enough, and our clients are saying, same boring old people, no fresh ideas. How do we broaden our talent pool?
Yeah.
In Britain for the last, decade, people over the age of 50, 55, 50 has been one answer to how you broaden your talent pool. And that obviously got much more true in the pandemic because a lot of them retired early.
Yeah.
Right. So we now have this, I don't know whether it's a problem, but this situation where a very large number of people between 55 and retirement age are not working. But those are talented people who could go and do a good job for someone.
Yeah.
Who is currently sitting there thinking, I got vacancies coming out of my ears.
Yeah.
Where are the people? And so I started pushing this thing about late bloomers, right? And it became apparent to me that this was not an area of particular interest, even though in many ways more diverse hiring is of interest to corporations, right? So if you're a mother and you've been out of the workforce for 5 years, they're desperate to find ways to change the recruitment process, reinduct you into the business, give you training. Like, they know that they've kind of locked you out and they need to bring you back in.
Yeah.
If you're neurodiverse, they want to do what they need to do to make the environment workable because they know that there's talent out there that they're not getting.
Yeah.
When it comes to you're a 55-year-old man and you're sort of looking to change career or whatever, that's a much less obvious proposition to these organizations. Partly because it doesn't have a kind of D&I benefit, I think, but partly because there are a lot of, beliefs, right, among senior people that we need fresh, new, young, right, innovative. Innovative's a great word.
People that move quickly.
Yeah, we need some pep. Now, age correlates like 0 to performance.
Yeah.
But it is a belief just like there is a very widespread belief among senior people that extroverts make better leaders and executives than introverts.
Yeah.
Again, I've never seen any studies that support that. It may or may not be true, but it is a very strongly held belief.
Yeah.
So late bloomers, I was like, it's one of these beliefs. They don't think it's real. And eventually I got sick of being told by my clients, why are you talking about these people again? So I left and wrote a book.
And that discovery of talent, though, and I think of it more from the UK's point of view, that we just aren't making the most of our talents, and nobody does. But as we've been in a knowledge economy for the last 30 years, making the most of that talent is going to matter more and more. And also talent has changed. It's going to change dramatically with AI as well. Like, again, what's required. And it feels like employers, even the best ones that recruit hundreds of people, still aren't on top of how all this has changed.
I think the employers probably are. They have teams dedicated to it. They're doing a lot. But talent allocation is really tricky. Yeah. And I think it's a knowledge problem. Getting the information you need to make the right hire is actually a lot harder than it looks. It's very difficult, really, to judge someone on a CV in a couple of interviews. You can get really good at it, and you can make lots of really good decisions, but you can't get faultless.
Yeah.
And it's, in my personal experience, surprising that senior people can often be quite bad at recruitment.
Yeah.
When they
Why is that?
Because they don't value it as a skill. They don't think they need to practice it and work on it. They think they're good at spotting people or whatever.
Yeah.
But of course, talent spotters have developed that skill in the way that you develop any other. And also cost. Recruiting people, like when you advertise to sell shoes and chocolate, that's adding to the top line.
Yeah.
When you hire people, and it's an immediate hit on the bottom line.
Yeah.
So you're always trying to make your recruitment more efficient. Particularly if you're a big organization, you're going to have large volume of applicants.
Yeah.
Right? So this dreamy, everyone gets a one-to-one assessment and we really go and find all the right people, you're bankrupt.
Yeah.
So those are the challenges.
And so who was the first character in the book that you thought, I'm going to base this around?
Penelope Fitzgerald, who ended up not having her own chapter, much to my disappointment. But I had too many words and I wanted to... So I cut her down, but I have published the full chapter on my Substack.
Okay.
So anyone who wants, the full 8,000 words or whatever it is, can go and get it. But she's a wonderful novelist, really, really a great novelist. And she didn't start writing novels until she was 60. And because she was an old lady, right, and she wore Marks and Spencer's coats, and she'd been born in the First World War, so she just had this whole kind of old lady from another world vibe.
Yeah.
She kind of got a little bit overlooked in the age of Martin Amis and leather jackets and Ian McEwan and, writers being cool and whatever. And so I've always enjoyed her books. And I thought, well, actually, there are a lot more people like her.
Yeah.
And when I realized that, I started sort of accumulating.
And you sort of started noting...
Yeah, I just started accumulating it and doing blogging about it a bit. And then I was like, actually, this is a whole subject that hasn't been dealt with properly yet.
And how do you define late bloomer?
Some people want a number, right? You're a late bloomer if you haven't done it by, X age. And you can kind of do that discipline by discipline, right? So if you're a professional tennis player and you get really serious when you're 20, that's pretty late.
Yes.
If you're a mathematician and you start doing your best work in your late 30s and 40s, you might be considered a late bloomer by your colleagues. If you're a historian, you could come out with your best work, in your 80s. So it can change, but I don't like any of this because I think it takes too seriously what we have already measured. Right, so the average age of achievement in different disciplines, we've got data for the last 100 or 200 years or whatever. But that's just the way things are at the moment. That's not necessarily like discovering some law of physics that says it won't change. And there are fluctuations over time depending on different conditions, different circumstances. So I think of a late bloomer as someone who achieves something after the point when no one expects them to anymore. Right? So Margaret Thatcher became party leader aged 50, 49, 50, which is, I did a sort of brief calculation of Tory leaders. It's just roughly the average age that they do it. But most of them have come through the ranks. They've been through a few cabinet positions. They've been groomed to be leader. They've been talked about, right? Margaret Thatcher, a few weeks before the leadership election, her own supporters were saying, oh my God, we can't have Margaret, Dreadful. She was 50 to 1 against at the bookies. There was absolutely no sign, one or two, but really no one took her seriously as a potential leader until suddenly she was the leader.
Yeah.
And so she's a late bloomer in the sense that she did it after the point when anyone thought she really would.
And do you think that makes people better at it? I mean, no, Margaret Thatcher makes people have many views on different things, but like you can't deny she's a transformational prime minister, hugely impactful. I remember Nick Robinson sort of on the steps of number 10 when she died, saying a lot of people who have held office since then have actually provoked a lot of indifference, although that might have changed in the last few years. But
we might welcome some indifference.
Yeah, exactly. But do you think that sort of, once that potential then begins to get realised, that it can almost be a quicker flywheel because of it? So once they become party leader and Penelope Fitzgerald, once the first book is published, do they then have a quicker sort of ascent?
I don't think so. I can't think that they do. I think it's a sort of defence against complacency, though. A lot of people reach a particular stage in their life, whether it's an age, a level of promotion, a level of income, right, whatever, and they sort of think, well, I don't need the hunger to keep going in that way anymore. Whereas if you're a late bloomer and it's like, well, I'm finally here.
Yeah.
You're going to get a second wind and push ahead. I don't know whether that makes you like outperform. I haven't got any sort of demonstration of that. But that is a difference, yeah.
But it was one of the bits of the book I enjoyed most. You talk about the complacency trap. Because I think that happens to a lot of people.
Yeah.
And, you get status in a job, you get a good salary, and all of a sudden it makes you more risk averse. And that's what I think we lack a lot of country, is taking risks. And it's a really big thing that I think happens to a lot of people is, complacency, almost like competency trap.
Absolute competency trap. Yeah, you remember what it was like to be 25, learning everything. It's like a real struggle.
Yeah.
And now you're really good, you're really competent. The idea of going back and having another long period of being incompetent, as it were, is very, very off-putting.
Yeah.
For understandable reasons, right? But it can be a big limiting factor on, making a change. Whereas late bloomers may or may not have enjoyed that level of sort of complacency. And so it makes it easier for them to make these big changes because they haven't done it yet. So the trap, it works differently for that. But if you want to make a big change, it is worth considering that, I was speaking to someone the other day who's been made redundant. And it's this really challenging thing of like, I do want to go and do something else. I don't want to go back in. But, I can go back in and go somewhere else, make good money. Like, I know what I'm doing. I've got kids. Mortgage. If I do something new, it's a whole new sort of ball game, right?
Yeah.
And it is a real consideration.
Yeah, and it's that thing. I mean, I remember when we started the podcast and like promoting it, but we had to do all these TikToks and whatever. I mean, I cringed. I cringed when I did it, and I cringe when I look at them now as well. Like, but it's a real example of like, you've got to do this stuff. And it's one of the best things that we ever did for discoverability. And
it's a bit of cringe.
Yeah.
So what? Like ultimately, it's not that bad, but it's something you have to sort of be prepared to go through and take a status hit or whatever but it's not like no one's going to cut your finger off.
Yeah, and you're thinking about it a lot more than anyone else is as well, right?
Yeah, of course. But I mean, when I say like, it is a real thing that like, it is really nice to be competent. It is really nice to sit down at your desk in the morning and be able to just do your work and be good at it.
Yeah.
It's obviously not as nice to like spend 2 or 3 years being bad at something and cringing and thinking, I don't even know how to begin this. And like, it's a much less easy life. It's a real trade-off. But as I say, it's not, it's not that bad.
There's also one of those things of where it just ends up, a lot of the blocks can end up clicking together quite fast because you can be useless at things for quite a long time and actually you realise you're sort of putting and then all of a sudden the jigsaw comes together quite quickly. But how did you go about sort of your process for this and I guess it's trying to think of a model that's interesting for other people to think of as well, that they can use. What kind of frameworks did you use and so on?
To think about how people become late bloomers.
Yeah, and how did you do it yourself as well? Like, not that you're necessarily a late bloomer, but just...
Why not?
Yeah.
I'll claim anyone as a late bloomer. Yeah. So the basic framework I have in the book is based on a really interesting study from Northwestern about hot streaks. So people have this 10 to 15 year period in their career where they just produce loads of work, and it's really good work. And you get this in sports and other things, right? You just have this hot streak. How do people do this? And the paper looks at scientists, artists, like a wide range of types of work, right? And they conclude that it's a bit like the explore-exploit model. So that you have this period when you're exploring and trying different things and looking at different areas. So if you're a scientist, you might be doing experiments of different nature, or looking at different kinds of subjects or whatever. And at some point, you switch into an exploit mode. So you move to a more commercial lab where there's a team set up to help you do delivery rather than being off on your own in some university, just like having your ideas or whatever, right? And then you can take whatever it is you discovered in the explore phase and really get to work on it.
Yeah.
Now, it might not be the last thing you discovered. It's the most interesting thing, the thing you really want to work on, right? What the paper said was making the switch is what really matters. You have to do both phases, and you have to make that decision to change. And we all know people who spend way too long in explore mode and just sort of become dabblers. Yeah. Right? And we just talked about getting stuck in the exploit mode because you're constantly in the competency trap and you just want to keep doing your thing. And what they concluded is, and if you think about Margaret Thatcher, that's exactly what happened to her. Yeah. Right? Penelope Fitzgerald, it's exactly what happened to her. And when I read that paper quite close to the end, and I was like, oh my goodness. That is all of them are like that. And so you've got to think about what have I been exploring? What am I good at? What have I been interested in? It doesn't have to be something from this week, right? You need to look back and think of all the things you've done. And you can see how, like in my career, working in employer branding and doing all that research turned out to be very useful for a book like this. Yeah. Right now, you don't know that at the time. It's not necessarily the way you're thinking about it, but you've got to think. Sometimes people say the pieces come together, and they say it in this it's almost like magic puts the pieces. No, you have to do it. You have to think, what are the pieces? What is the picture? Like, what can I do with this stuff? Like a chef saying, this is your bag of ingredients. What are the ways you can work with it? And the Steve Jobs commencement speech at Stanford is very kind of good example of how he did all these different things and went to a calligraphy class and learnt design and all of that. Of you go through these moments in life. I do sometimes wonder how much memory kind of gets reinforced though. Just think about, I remember when I was at Number 10 meeting a guy playing squash actually who did podcasts, and this is back 2017, 2018. So this is not podcast wasn't the kind of national lexicon that it is now. And I remember being so interested and asking him so many questions about it. Now sometimes I look back at that and think, you're clearly always very interested in that space. But I also now wonder, because I've done a podcast for the last 3 years, do I go back to that moment and replay it more and more in my head? And I don't know what the answer is. You come from a background where there were lots of people around who were really interesting to talk to. You probably were always wanting to ask something, and maybe you didn't ask. You can't just sit down in Number 10 and be like, so tell me. Right, but I tell what it's like running HSBC. I expect that what interested you about podcasts is that actually it was pulling together lots of things that you were already doing, interested in, curious about, and good at. But no one had ever the idea of going into radio would not quite be the same thing. It wasn't obvious what's the thing. As soon as you find the thing, you go, I sort of do that already. Yeah, it's two things. Well, one of the interesting things about podcasts is it evolves, right? In the last few weeks, we've had a lot more comedians on. I've got more interest in that. I'm very interested in the job of a comedian, how writers' rooms work, etc. But also on that employer brand thing, it's interesting because I remember going to a wedding, telling someone I was a podcaster, and they were like, "Oh, it's amazing, it's brilliant! Wow, that's got to be the most interesting job I've ever heard of." And then I thought afterwards, I was like, "You wouldn't say that if I was a local Radio Kent BBC host." Yeah.
we've probably got about a similar size audiences, frankly. So it's not to do with that, but but it's employer brand, right? Like,
Totally.
You know, you say you host podcasts or whatever, and people think that's really interesting. You say you host a webinar. Well, it's not so interesting, is it?
But it's drawing on similar things.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But the branding bit of it, it's just interesting.
Yeah.
Things kind of come together. So how did you go about who were the second, third, fourth characters in the book then that you kind of like?
Well, I don't remember exactly the order, and when I remember very distinctly reading a wonderful book called God's Architect about Michelangelo, and thinking I had no idea Michelangelo had been. I knew it was sort of a late bloomer, but this really was a remarkable book. I was very excited by it, and I discovered that 3 or 4 years earlier I'd blogged about Michelangelo as a late bloomer, based on something I'd read about this book. So you sort of do something. You reach a point where you've done so much research. You have to be very careful. Keep going back in your notes. And so I don't quite know the order in which I sort of gathered them all. But like I already knew about Margaret Thatcher. Knew about Samuel Johnson. Like a lot of them were.
But tell us about Michelangelo and the late blooming there.
So Michelangelo is very famous for his sculpture, right? And he did that in his 20s, and I think Vasari says something like, he just appeared with a talent from God, and it was amazing. And then in middle age, he really becomes a painter at Sistine Chapel. He does the Day of Judgment when he's 60.
Yeah.
And then at the time when he wanted to retire, he was in Rome and he wanted to go back home to Florence. He wanted to retire, and the Pope said, "I want you to Bramante is dead. I want you to finish some pieces."
Yeah.
And he said, "Well, no, I want to retire." And the Pope said, "No, I'm the Pope, and I'm asking you that I want you to, do this." And Michelangelo said, "But I'm not an architect." And this was very interesting, right? Because he'd done some architectural designs, but it wasn't a big part of his career at all. And none of his projects had come to completion. Because obviously it takes a long time to build the sorts of things he's proposing. But the Pope knew that Michelangelo was, the great artistic talent of his time. And he knew that he could do it. And he said again, "I'm the Pope and I'm asking you to build my church. Like, what do you think you're doing?" Michael goes, "All right, yeah." And he becomes obviously an amazing architect. That is a phenomenal achievement. And he makes changes to the design because he knows it's not going to work. And so the way that particularly the area of the dome is built, that is Michelangelo's church, right?
Yeah.
But he also becomes incredibly good at running the building site. And this is really, in a way, slightly ridiculous thing to say, but Michelangelo as, a man who can run a construction site is in a way more impressive late blooming because he's got hundreds of workers, all very skilled, like stonemasons and whatever. And there are serious questions of how do you get a really, really big piece of stone all the way to the top? And so you have to be very good at finding good rope, which is not a simple task, right? In the Renaissance, like we can just get good rope. This is a real thing for him. Questions of they all worked for the other guy, so he's got to make them trust him, right? And he becomes very good at that. And also this thing about they're all up on the scaffolding, right? Carving away or whatever. Not only has he got to go up there and say, no, not like that. Give me the chisel, right? Like this, He's also got to make sure if they come down for lunch, right, he's losing hours because they're all the way at the top and there's no lift, So he devises a method of having food and water taken up on donkeys who go up these planks up the scaffolding, right? So there are hundreds of these things. And he becomes amazing at running this building site, partly because he's in a race against time, right, to get his work done, and partly because he knows that if he can't do that, his design is for nothing.
Yeah.
And so he really flourishes in that. And that's a very, very different thing for him to be doing. And in his 70s, right? Like very late in his career. And then he goes home in the evening and he still wants to make one final sculpture. He doesn't quite succeed at this. But he made himself a hat with candle holders so that at night he could keep carving. So he sort of embodies this kind of superhuman determination. So that's Michelangelo's God's Architect. Fantastic book. I recommend it to everyone.
You do take phenomenal kind of notes, and the extended reading bits and footnotes at the end is makes up a decent chunk of it as well.
Yeah.
Talk to us about the process of how you got funding for the book, because I also think this is really interesting through Tyler Cowen and Emergent Ventures.
Yeah.
How does it work?
Well, Tyler Cowen writes about it on his blog, Marginal Revolution, and there's a web page for it. It's a funding scheme for projects that sort of moonshot projects, I guess. And most of the people who've been funded, I should say, are much more impressive. They're doing incredible sort of engineering, scientific research, AI. I mean, all sorts of really, really impressive things. But it's a small scheme. It's run, Tyler's an American economist. It's run out of the think tank that he is attached to his university. And I read Marginal Revolution. I'm a follower of that blog. And I thought, well, he might be interested in a book on late bloomers. So I applied.
But it was, unlike a lot of these grant applications, quite a simple...
It's one-page application.
Yeah.
It's not about your credentials, or anything like that. It's about the credibility of your idea and your ability to execute it. And there's a one-page application and a short interview, and
that was it.
Yes or no. Yeah.
And how long did it take you to kind of write the book, for it to
go? Between 12 to 18 months, and then time for copy edits and things going backwards and forwards, but sort of 12 to 18 months of full-time and then part-time, yeah.
And one of the interesting bits in it was the World War II and using that as a case study.
Yeah.
And how that sort of ends up becoming an enormous kind of experiment in talent and shifting talent around. What it was particularly interesting, I found, was how it led to sort of female philosophers stepping up at the University of Oxford. But it is one of these. Can you talk us through that?
There's a really good book called Metaphysical Animals. It's about the generation. There's a group of 4 philosophers. I'm probably going to forget their names. Iris Murdoch, Elizabeth Anscombe, Philippa Foot, and Mary Midgley. Oh, look.
That's kind of brilliant.
Elizabeth Anscombe obviously is a sort of major figure, Wittgenstein's editor, major figure in philosophy of mind and other areas. Philippa Foot was a huge figure in ethics, originator of the trolley problem, which I believe everyone is now familiar with. Iris Murdoch is Iris Murdoch. And these 4 women knew each other as sort of undergrads or postgrads at Oxford. And what was interesting was that a lot of the men in the philosophy department were called away to do war work, civil service, serving, whatever. And so there was a kind of relaxed atmosphere about these women doing philosophy, for one thing, which was a bit sort of, men do philosophy at Oxford and you're in a skirt.
Yeah.
Right. But also they weren't doing analytical philosophy, which is this sort of dry, logical philosophy about the way in which language works. They were going back to more sort of Platonic, ethical, classical philosophy, which was deemed to be meaningless. Literally, these questions aren't even worth asking. And so they were also able to sort of think about, not just that they could practice philosophy, but they could think about ideas that had been previously sort of, taken off the table. And so it's a little natural experiment in showing that, would we have known? How would we have known? Like, what would have happened? I'm sure they would have come through in some way, but I like those sort of periods because it shows you that actually maybe you don't quite know who the talent is around you and what it is they could do in the right circumstances. It's, a little unsettling to think of those 4 women having been there 5 to 10 years earlier. Would things have worked out in quite the same way?
Yeah. That point about talent spotting is probably something that we all think that we're good at. Your point about chief executives earlier, sort of thinking, well, it's just something that I don't need to work on, etc. What are the types of talent that perhaps go unrecognised on that surface level?
Well, there are different things, right? So the Anscombe Group and Margaret Thatcher are good examples of where you're not going to notice talent because of demographic considerations, right? And almost you don't even care if they are talented. There's just that kind of...
Yeah.
It's not even a question to you. Then there are areas where it is just genuinely very difficult to know. So it is really hard to know who's going to be a good prime minister.
Yeah.
Because you can't do a dry run. Whereas, like, will Elizabeth Anscombe be a great philosopher? Some combination of her talking to other philosophers and them reading her early work is going to give you a good sense of what kind of capability she's got, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that was true. So any kind of intellectual work or work that involves writing, I think, it's potentially easier to get around the biases and the sort of not thinking about certain groups of people, because you can just put the work out and someone who knows a lot can look at it and say, you know, that's interesting. Now, maybe you need to make it like a blind CV kind of situation or whatever, but that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Whereas it's those jobs, you know, if you're a great musician, you can just turn up one day and play and someone should be able to say, crumbs,
That's it.
wow, yeah. Whereas something like in business and politics, it can be entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
I think most of the time talent pushes itself forward, but I don't think we know the margins at which we're not spotting good people. But I mean, Westminster's a great one for that.
Yeah.
The history of they could have been a great prime minister is probably bigger than the history of they were the prime minister. You know, like,
yeah. But your point about pushing forward, though, that does sort of lend itself to the extroverts as well.
So I don't quite mean it like that. What I mean is that, like, I don't know whether you'd call Margaret Thatcher an extrovert, but her talents made themselves known, just not in the conventional way. And the one or two people were clever enough to look at her and say, she's got all these wonderful qualities. Why isn't anyone doing anything with that?
Yeah.
So I sort of think if it hides out in the open. Kay Graham, who ran the Washington Post, right?
First chapter, right?
Right. Yeah, she's the opening. It's a great story. But no one believed she could do anything. I mean, she was really treated so badly. But her father had this kind of low-level residual belief in her, and I think that sort of got her through what was essentially a marriage where she was bullied, belittled, had her confidence sort of ripped out. But very few people looked at her and said, she's going to be a great CEO. But in what I try and show in a chapter is the elements were all there. Right? Warren Buffett came and invested in her for a reason.
Yeah.
And that was because he didn't have the sort of the biases that hung over all the people who were close to her. And he could just look at her and say, she has the qualities of a great CEO, and I don't care that she didn't do anything before this. You know, I can see that she's got the talent.
Yeah.
So that's what I mean. Like, she made herself known.
Because she takes over at 45, right?
Yeah, 45, 46. And she hadn't done it before that. And I mean, I don't think she believed she could do it in a way. That's what she says.
Yeah.
But many of the qualities were there, and they had made themselves known, but not in the traditional sense. And that, you know, that's the real challenge.
I do think, going back to this sort of extroverts introverts thing, though, I think it is part of the problem with our politics. Many problems, I'm sure people will say, but like it does sort of lend itself to sort of extroverts and those that can public speak, which is funny because actually the job of a member of parliament, public speaking, is becoming less and less important. But that's sort of, I think so, in terms of the way that communication has become more broad and there are more ways of doing it. The sort of, well, perhaps there's a difference here between sort of oracy and communication in terms of that being able to hold a crowd in a public meeting is no longer as important. Now, arguably, maybe it was not as important as we ever did think it was, but we sort of think back to the age of where, you know, these public meetings, Tony Benn, the like, would sort of galvanise people via that, whereas there's different ways of doing that now.
I think you have to be good on camera to be a successful politician today. And I think that is the thing that separates out people who succeed and who don't. There are lots of other things that separate them out, right? But that is, like, we will both have met MPs who are very good, at their job, very intelligent, make a serious contribution, and they just aren't really known and aren't really prominent because
Yeah.
they're kind of dull in front of a camera, through no fault of their own, right?
Yeah.
People said that about... Were you ever in the room with Ed Miliband?
Yeah.
Fantastic charisma, right? He had real kind of presence, and somehow it just didn't go onto the screen at all. I always felt that was like deeply unfair, because it totally changed how he was. I'm not saying like he should have won or whatever, but
Yeah.
that was a really weird thing to experience. And if you look at like the last however many prime ministers, of recent years, being good on camera is quite a significant, part of what makes them sort of get office.
Yeah.
And it's quite a significant part of how they're judged in office, I think.
Yeah, I think that is fair. And of course, Winston Churchill, another example of a late bloomer who, people sort of almost written off.
He is interesting because he took himself out of the game. People forget that he was Chancellor from 25 to 30, I think. And then he resigned because he wanted more freedom to speak against about India and to say that we should keep India in the empire. And he disagreed with Baldwin. And I mean, he was way more imperial and racist than the other right wingers of his day. I mean, he was out there, right? So he resigned because he wanted to sort of go off into this, frankly, quite crazy, issue. And so the idea that he was put in the wilderness, I think it's wrong. And I think that took hold in the late 30s when he really was one of the few people saying, we have got to stop appeasement now. This has gone way, like we are in real danger here. And so that changed the narrative. But there was this long stretch where he took himself out of the game. So he's an interesting late bloomer because if he hadn't come back, it would kind of been his own fault.
Yeah.
Right, it was his own kind of stubbornness, preoccupations, and whether or not people talk about that as a period of him sort of being a failure, I don't know. Like he wrote the Marlborough book then. I mean, it's very difficult to judge, but in terms of political office, definitely, and in terms of his like waning political influence, that's probably true. But it was his choice. He's a rare example of someone who wasn't kept out; he took himself out.
Yeah.
And I wonder how many other late bloomers are like that. They actually decide that I could go further up, I could get the top job, I could push myself, but you know what? I believe in something weird and crazy over here, and I care more about that. I have no idea. It's very difficult to know, right? But he's a really interesting case study for that.
Do you think we'll get more late bloomers?
Yeah, I think the internet and potentially AI are really interesting ways of flushing out new talent. So one of the very early YouTubers, I can't remember if I put this in the book or not, but like back in the early days when you could only upload, was it 3 minutes on YouTube? And the video would literally just sort of stop and everything. One of the most popular YouTubers was like this pensioner. I can't remember where he lived, somewhere sort of relatively, he wasn't like in London or anything. And he was really cute. He used to vlog every day about his life, and he became this like YouTube celebrity for a while. It's hard to imagine that happening in the current sort of cultural mix online, but it is really interesting.
Yeah, but you mentioned like the marrow grower and stuff like that, who had a big kind of revolution.
The big veg guy.
Yeah.
I know.
But it is interesting, those like, the whole everyone will be famous 15 minutes, phenomenon. Like it's happening more and more in that sense.
And I think that, so the obvious way in which modern technology creates late bloomers is in this kind of we're no longer talking about people of high accomplishment, but we're talking about people who just changed their life, and I mean, great, I think we should have it all, right? The people of high accomplishment, it may be less obvious to us, right? It may be less obvious to us that someone in their 40s or 50s started writing very long technical blogs about some issue that we don't understand, and that somehow changes their career and gets them pulled into a new orbit or whatever. I believe, like I think a lot of AI talent is discovered in this kind of, it was just people talking online and discovering each other. Now, I don't know how many late bloomers there are. That's kind of an industry that skews young. But it won't be particularly clear to us. the ways in which these technologies are enabling late blooming. But I think they clearly are, right?
Yeah.
And long may it continue. And I expect AI will do a similar thing.
Yeah, I think that's true as well. Speaking of AI, in the acknowledgements of the book,
Yeah.
you thank ChatGPT not for helping you write it.
No.
Just tell us, because you've become a bit of an expert as well, how to use it, how you did use it to help you write the book.
There are 2 or 3 things, right? First, as a research tool, which obviously has mixed blessing in terms of accuracy. But if you ask it the question in the right way and you use it as a starting point and then go back to sort of traditional research, it can help you speed the process up.
Yeah.
And you can say, I'm looking for X sort of things. Here is what I've already got. Here's what I know. You can write quite a detailed prompt, and it can be very useful. I think it's a decent editor.
Yeah.
Not just at the level of, you misspelt that word, you're missing a full stop or whatever, but at the level of like, read this chapter and tell me what's wrong with it. Now, some people say, well, it doesn't tell you anything that you don't already know, or that like your partner wouldn't tell you, or your friends or whatever. And I'm like, sure, but neither do they.
Yeah.
Like when you give it to people, their feedback is very often you go, yeah, you're right, it drags, page 4 is rubbish, like whatever. What you need is for someone to tell you that, and to just have that point in the process where you go, yeah, I've got to rework this. And you need it quickly.
Yeah.
And ChatGPT will give it to you right now, whereas your friend, editor, wife, whatever, will give it to you like next week.
Yeah.
Right? And so just at that, I think it's great for that. And I think things like Claude are really, really good for that. And obviously Perplexity is great for research.
Yeah.
Really good.
What's Perplexity?
Perplexity AI is unlike ChatGPT. It's more of a sort of search engine AI.
Okay.
So you put in, what is the latest state of the British labour market, and whereas ChatGPT will sort of create an answer based on stuff that it knew like a year ago, and it's not going to be totally accurate. Perplexity is going to Google search that, bring in various sources, and then write you a little thing saying, these are the stats, this is the position, and footnote the claims so that you can click through. Now, you do sometimes click through, and it's like you've just completely got that wrong.
Yeah,
you've misunderstood, particularly if it's like in a long, more technical piece, right? But it's a really, really good search engine, really good piece of research. And if you use the pro setting, it'll throw up 15 or 20 links. And I think Google now is like a real pain in the foot and not very helpful. And Perplexity is, fantastic.
Well, note to the team to check that one out. No, that'll be really interesting. 2 types of intelligence that you write about in the book as well, in terms of crystallized versus fluid.
Yeah.
Explain those to us, because I found that fascinating.
So this is a standard distinction made in intelligence research between your ability to take in new information and think creatively with it and deal with it and understand it, and that's fluid. And the typical example is like, why is the 12-year-old in the house the one who can work all the gadgets, right? Well, they don't even need the manual. They just sort of look at it and push button, right? Whereas the grown-ups are going, sorry, what did you push? Where's the did you say the blue? What? And it's because their fluid intelligence is so high, you can just throw stuff at them and they're like, great, got it.
Yeah.
Right, which is why they're so good at adapting to new technology, video games, like all this stuff. Whereas crystallized intelligence is the stuff you know, right? So, the older you get, the more facts you retain about the Battle of Trafalgar, or, World War II or whatever. And you don't need necessarily the same level of fluid intelligence to sort of take in lots of new information and rapidly, recombine it and work it out.
Yeah.
You need that sort of solid grounding that you can then keep building on, right?
Yeah.
Which gives you that. So one analogy is like poets versus historians. you're 20, you've got the fluid intelligence of John Keats, and you start churning out all these odes and stuff, and it's, no one knows where you came from.
Yeah.
Whereas, like, if you want to be a great historian, you need to sort of plug away at it for 50 years.
Yeah.
And then, put together this sort of immense thing that you've been working on. Now, I shouldn't say things like this because I'm like not an expert. I don't know if we should take that in exactly the hard and fast way that it is presented, right? I think it's obviously true and it's obviously useful, but it's a model of intelligence, and not everything is going to fit like super neatly into it. But the general idea is that as you age, sort of roughly after the age that I think I've just passed, troublingly, your fluid intelligence declines.
But it's that talk of, and that's because the other thing is you talk about myelin as well in it, if I'm getting that.
Yeah.
And how, but sometimes, and this is one of the things that I think in a world that does feel like sometimes it's getting younger and younger and putting more emphasis on the young and that skill set, is that actually that fluid intelligence side doesn't decline till quite a lot later than we sometimes think.
It depends. I think it declines in your late 20s, early 30s.
Yeah.
That's when you really peak. Maybe even earlier. It sort of plateaus for a bit.
Yeah.
What I think though is that like you need both. Both are good. If you have sort of some decline in fluid intelligence, executive function, whatever, collaborate with someone then. Like a lot of great work is done like that. Why shouldn't a 30-year-old and a 60-year-old work together and bring the best of both, right?
Completely.
That seems like some people say like, oh, fluid intelligence declines, so when you're after the age of 50, you're not going to be able to do X, Y, Z sort of things. And it's like, to me, this seems very solvable. The best collaboration I've had in my career was between me and a boss who was, I don't know if we were 30 and 60, but that kind of gap.
Yeah.
And it was great because I was throwing out ideas and he was like, of the 600 things you just said, 2 of them are good.
Yeah.
What a perfect combination, right? And so what the whole chapter there is trying to say, like, this is real, I'm not like trying to doubt the science or whatever, but it's not necessarily a prescription for, oh, you're 50, you should give up. It just makes you rethink how you do things.
Yeah. No, it's really interesting. Explain to us how Thomas Edison is a late bloomer.
Edison's a classic example of a child late bloomer. His teachers told him he was stupid, and school wasn't working for him to the extent that his mother took him out and homeschooled him. And then, when he was 18, 19, he took himself off to become the world's greatest inventor.
Yeah.
So it's a really good example of how the potential you display at a very young age is not necessarily what you're going to become, and it really depends on the environment. The big theme of the book is if you change your environment, you can make quite a significant difference to yourself.
Yeah. How is Vera Wang a late bloomer?
Vera Wang is what I call a double peaker. So when she was, I think 17, 18, 19, she was like Olympic level ice skater, figure skater, right? And she realized she was not going to be the number one. So she left figure skating and went off and did a degree and was very interested in fashion and ended up working at Vogue. And then she had this very good, but in many ways perfectly ordinary journalism career. And she again realized, I'm not going to become the number one at Vogue, because she doesn't want to do dinner parties and handshakes and all that.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So she left and she went to work for Ralph Lauren, and she had some sort of personal difficulties, and her life sort of reaches this kind of, bit stuck. And when she got married, she'd noticed that the wedding dress market was just very boring and samey. And her father said, start a business. Right? Designing dresses is fun, but so is running a business. And so she sets off, I think over the age of 40, into this brand new career. And when she wants to move out of wedding dresses and expand, a very prominent Olympic figure skater comes to her and says, I need an outfit. And can you imagine anyone better suited to make that outfit? And after that, she becomes Vera Wang.
Matt Clifford the other day tweeted, what's the best thing? What is, to be the 20th best in the world, what's the best thing and what's the worst thing? And he said, original answers only, not things like making money, which I thought was great. Did you have a response to that?
I saw it and I did think about it a little bit. I wonder if like classical pianist might be the answer.
Yeah.
You can the 20th best classical pianist today is like really, really good.
Yeah.
Really good by historical standards. No one's heard of you.
Yeah.
No one cares. Right? Now, I don't know how dispiriting that really is, because you probably get to live the life of a classical pianist, and that's wonderful. But I think there are jobs like that where you can be really quite good by historical standards, and it's just sort of, sorry, you're not that famous.
Yeah. And that's sometimes not a bad thing as well, the flip side of that, right? It's probably like being the 20th best golfer in the world. Like, I could walk past them, and I'm sure 98% of the world's population could not even bat an eyelid at it.
I bet it's quite career limiting, though.
Yeah.
If I could just pick you up and drop you back like 100 years ago, probably have a very different sort of career. I don't know. That was my sort of speculation.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. Why is Helen down here, late bloomer?
She's an artist, and she didn't become prominent until, past the middle of her life. I hope that's not a rude thing to say. And she put her work on Instagram, and this gave her it's got her working for lots of people, and then she ended up, I think, collaborating with BP. Obviously, most artists through history would be insanely jealous of the ability to do this, right?
Yeah.
That's another good story about how the internet can change your career. And you don't have to become a household name. We don't all have to know that's what happened. But without Instagram, that would have been a much harder process for him.
How is Audrey Sutherland a late bloomer?
Audrey Sutherland is one of the best people in the book. She solo explored the coast of Alaska and British Columbia, right, in the Arctic, in her 60s, 70s, and 80s. Right, she went up there on her own. These are Arctic waters. She has bear encounters. Right, she's sleeping in old huts that need doing up. Like, she is a phenomenal woman. She started exploring Hawaiian Islands in her 40s. She had to do swimming to get around different parts of it, so she got herself an inflatable kayak, which was orange, and it's inflatable, so it's light enough for her to haul around when she's on her own. People are mocking her. Other kayakers always, inflatable kayak, and it's orange. Oh my goodness. But off she goes. And she gradually develops into this woman who doesn't just explore the Hawaiian Islands and the warm waters there, but who can go and do this solo Arctic exploration in her 70s. Quite phenomenal.
You touched on something there that we haven't spoke much about, but let's just sort of round off on it. Like, connections and environment being so important for it. It's like something I tell the guys here that I'm constantly on at them about is like, go to events, try and build up a bit of a kind of crew in your early years. Yeah. Because those formative years are really important for that. And it's quite challenging to do. Like, it's very trial and error based. Like, go to these things, just see who you meet. Yeah. But you talk in the book as well about like changing your environment as well. Yeah. I think that's often the biggest thing that people don't sort of realise. What's your, what are your kind of reflections on that? Like some of that bit of the book up for us.
Anyone who's worked in different industries will know that you can have qualities drawn out of you in a very different way depending on who you're working with and where you are. So if you work in a professional kitchen versus you work in an office versus you work in party politics in Westminster, you're going to have three incredibly different experiences. They're going to require very different things from you that are somewhat unrelated to your ability to do the job. They're sort of personality traits and anything like that, right? This can have a huge effect on your career and on the way you see yourself and on the trajectory that you're on. There's a great study of young men who were called up for World War II, who were delinquents. So very low attainment at school, on a trajectory either to go to jail or to be doing low-skilled, low-pay work. A stint in the army, right, so long as it obviously didn't kill them, it gave them everything they'd been missing: discipline, structure, equality, right? You're all just a soldier. So this thing about, oh, you're the idiot in the corner at school, that's gone, right? It gave them leadership. Many of them travelled. And it just sort of broadened their experience in this way. Many of them will have gone to college on the GI Bill, but many won't. They're all on, completely different life trajectories. They end up doing skilled work or better. Obviously, they avoid jail. It just completely overhauls what kind of life they're going to live. Now, I'm not saying, everyone can go in the army and whatever, but it's just another example of how if you can drop yourself into a new environment, it can be really, really good for you. It can also be really bad for you. And World War II is a cautionary tale about that as well, right?
Yeah. No, but it is interesting, and the benefits that gives as well, like national conscription, etc. Is I do think it's very interesting sort of observation for how because it was a great leveler as well for people, right? As well.
Yes.
Francis Ngannou as a late bloomer.
Yeah.
One of the names I was surprised to see in the book. Talk to us about his story and how he becomes an MMA fighter.
This is a great example. He was born in Cameroon, and he's doing child labor, right? And he saves enough money so that by the time he's 26, he can leave. But he obviously has to leave with smugglers to get to Europe. And so he goes on an absolutely life-threatening journey. I think there's a wonderful article about it online. I think there's a story about how the strain that they were under on the journey, someone nearly fell asleep and dropped a baby, and it had to be caught on the boat. And they were really in like these kind of extreme conditions. And it took him a long time to get to Europe, 6 or 7 attempts, right? And he nearly got arrested, and he had to break away and go on his own. So 26, gets to Europe. I mean, that in itself is more than I'm ever going to achieve.
Yeah.
But he'd gone there because he wanted to do mixed martial arts, because he'd been doing boxing and stuff in Cameroon, and he trains in a gym until he becomes an MMA champion. So it's just this incredible story of determination and resilience, and in a way, it puts everyone else in the book to shame.
Emmy, thanks so much for coming on Jimmy's Jobs of the Future. I could talk to you all day about this, and we should get you back on again at some stage to talk about any number of the characters and chapters. But tell us, when is the book out?
9th of May.
9th of
Pre-order
May.
it, order it. Get 2 copies. It's a great gift. If you give someone this book, they will be so flattered that you see this great potential in them.
Yeah, exactly. No, it's great. I've loved reading the pre-copy that you sent me, and the team have here as well. So thanks very much for coming on Jimmy's Jobs of the Future to talk about it.
Thanks for having me. I had a great time.